make sure I respect everybody's time.
We've got an hour or so, but build some time for questions.
Okay,
Does that work for
okay,
you?
that's great. Okay, so thank you all. I just would love to start out by asking you very briefly to say what your name is, what you do here at the paper, and then if you've had any, if you've heard of solutions journalism, and you have any questions or concerns that you want to make sure we address in this workshop, I'd love to know about that. Okay? So if you could just go around, that would be great.
Hi, Bruce DeMera. I'm a data reporter, and I really had not heard of solutions journalism up to this point.
Okay.
I'm a public editor and deal with our readers' concerns about accuracy and trust and transparency.
Great.
Kenyon Wallace, reporter, and have not heard of solutions journalism.
You had not?
No.
Okay.
I'm Shri, I'm a columnist. I tried to do my fellowship with the Solutions Journalism approach, and a question that I have today is, how do we do it in, I can see how it works in long form, I know there is an example of short form, but how do you do it in short form without it appearing like a plug?
Without it appearing?
Like a plug.
Like a plug, right, got it. Thank you, good question.
I'm Aisha Nasir. I work on the web desk here. The question I had was, who decides what the solution is?
Okay, good question.
My name's Jordan Tamblin. I'm a digital producer as well. I haven't heard of solutions journalism.
Okay.
I'm Brian Bradley. I'm a digital producer with fine folks next to me, and I'm aware of solutions journalism and keen to see how it fits and more so put into action.
Okay.
I'm Scott Colby, the opinions editor. I guess heard about it last week.
And you're one of the more experienced.
Yeah, I just want to know how it differs from stuff we've done in the past.
Right.
Where we have done big projects where we have offered solutions.
Okay.
I'm Lori Montserrat, and I'm the social justice reporter, and been here forever, and often part of big projects, and often the last piece is the solution piece.
Right, right.
And I guess are we tackling it? Should we be starting with the solutions piece? I wonder.
Okay. Great.
I'm David. I work on our email newsletter, so I'm especially interested in the way that kind of form and content can come together.
I'm sorry, David, I can't hear you very well.
Sorry. I work on email newsletters,
Uh-huh.
and I'm interested in the way that form and content can kind of come together to serve solutions journalism.
Okay. I would appreciate if you guys could speak up. I would normally come to you, but I'm told that since you're videotaping this that I'm got to stay in this little box right here. So.
I didn't say that. Come on.
Is it? Can I walk around?
Sure, you can walk around.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
Nicholas Chung, immigration reporter at the paper. I have the same question as Laurie. Like, we've done a lot of stories that, you know, very formative problem solutions. The solutions always come at the end of the series. Like, so I just want to get a sense of like how, you know, stories can be told differently.
Okay.
Kate Robertson, I'm an editor in the life section, and I just want to know how you're going to do this.
I'm sorry?
I just want to know how this is going to happen, how it comes about.
Okay.
Sahar Fatima, I'm a reporter here. I'm curious to know whether solutions journalism does attract more readers and more engagement.
I'm Sarah Moshe Hassane. I'm the work and wealth reporter, and actually when I started my beat, I think part of the idea behind it was to include it.
I'm sorry?
Part of when I started my beat, part of the idea behind it was to include the solutions journalism lens. But I feel like I've often felt like the problem is really like overwhelmed the number of solutions available. So yeah, I feel like sometimes it's a struggle to get the right balance.
Right.
It's like we're using your stories. I'm Wendy. I cover crime and policing. And I have heard of solutions journalism. And my question would be similar to what we've already had, which was just how do you do solutions journalism without it being kind of just a PR piece?
Right.
I'm Julie, and I'm data and diversity, and I hadn't heard of solutions journalism, but once Kathy started sending me things, I realized I'd been reading the Fixer all along, so I had been reading solutions journalism. I just didn't know it had an umbrella category. Okay.
I'm Matt. I'm an editor that works mostly with the City Hall Bureau. I'm not sure I've heard the term until recently, but it seems like something we do naturally.
Emily Matthew. I write about affordable and precarious housing. A little bit about solutions journalism, and same question. How do you do something? How do you do a short form that it's out of the PR club, right? Because I write a lot about developers. So how do I write about a developer that it's out of the PR club?
I'm Irene, editor at Star, and I'm really glad that you're here because of all these questions. Because it is something that we naturally, as an organization, really care about. Make sure that we're doing it in an effective way.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
So let's start out with a story. This is from one of our first partners, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and
Down. It's the arrow key.
yeah.
There
we go. Sorry. So they Cleveland has a big problem with lead paint, as do many cities in the United States, and they have done several series on lead paint in the past. And they have not had much impact. So one of the reporters we work with said this about previous attempts to write about lead paint. And I'll let you read what she said. So nothing took away the local excuses of, this is a terrible problem, we're doing the best we can, and nothing changes. So we helped them to start a new series that had a traditional investigative component looking at lead paint through the lens of race and geography in the city. They added a solutions component, and the effect of that was to take a problem that the city officials could dismiss as unavoidable and make it clear that it was in fact unacceptable. And the way it did that, according to George Rodriguez, the editor, was this way. What are our neighbors doing? It's working better. So by the way, I'll give a copy of this PowerPoint to Kathy to send around if people want it. So they did a couple of different things. They did stories, for example, about Rochester, New York, which had an overall much better approach to lead and what Rochester was doing and how they did it. But they also took little bite-sized chunks of the problem. Various cities around the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Akron, were doing better on pieces of the lead paint problem, the small slices. For example, creating a registry of houses that had lead paint, proactively testing school children. And I love this. They even published a chart in the paper that said, here's what successful cities do, and here's what Cleveland does. And you can imagine that is profoundly embarrassing to public officials in a way that simply exposing the problem in Cleveland is not. So it had a lot of effect. This was initially what happened just in the first few months, and it's kept going. And then this past July, the City Council finally passed a major overhaul that greatly increased the budget, the staff, and adopted many of the best practices found elsewhere. Found in Cleveland's neighbors. So this is an example of how you can use solutions journalism as part of an investigation to make your investigation stronger, to have more impact. So as Kathy said, I am co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network. We're an NGO. We started in 2013. We now have about 40 employees. We work all around the United States. We work with probably about 400 different newspapers and other news organizations, radio, TV, digital, in the US. We also work internationally quite a bit in a big program in Latin America, in Central and Eastern Europe, in various parts of the UK, Germany, France. This is our first training in Canada, I believe. So thank you for welcoming us, and we're about to start a Canada program here. So the Solutions Journalism Network grew out of a column that I and my co-founder David Bornstein write in the New York Times called Fixes. It's been running since 2010. Every week we look at something that works in social change and why it works, what separates success from failure. One of the great tools we have on our website is our story tracker. we collect solution stories, we vet them, we tag them, we summarize them, and then we link back to the story on your own website. So a lot of it are stories that our partners did. Some of it is just stuff we stumble across or people submit to us. But it's a great tool. It's highly searchable by all different ways, including keywords. So if you're starting a project, you can take a look and see what solution stories have been written out there. We have more than 1,000 different news outlets who have stories in here. So they really range from, you know, The Guardian and the New York Times and CNN to very hyper-local publications in, you know, one neighborhood of Detroit, that kind of thing. This is just an example of the search functions possible. And we also have toolkits to help teach solutions journalism on our website in our Learning Lab. Our basic toolkit is now out in 13 languages, but we have toolkits now for all sorts of different things. So what is solutions journalism? Our first partner was the Seattle Times, and we chose them deliberately because they were a very respected paper, very well known for their investigation and hard-hitting journalism. Their editor, David Boardman, was very interested in this, and so we helped them to start a unit called Education Lab. They were tired of writing story after story about how bad public education was in Seattle. So now, in addition to those stories, which they still do, they now do a package of stories every month about something that works in public education in the city, in the state of Washington, or elsewhere. And this was the very first story they wrote. And the key point here is this part of the caption. So what happened here at this elementary school where all of a sudden their test scores soared by double digits in 1 year? And could it be replicated elsewhere? That's very key. So a lot of times when we define solutions journalism, we find it useful to talk about what people think it is, but it really isn't. And so here are some solutions journalism imposters. So one is silver bullet stories. These are stories that overclaim. They say, this is the solution. Problem is now solved. That is never true, and it has no credibility with readers either. This story, which I'm ashamed to say ran in the New York Times, was about a soccer ball that doesn't deflate. And the first line was, sometimes a soccer ball is not just a ball. Sometimes it's a lifesaver. Okay? Overclaiming, going beyond what the data says. Better to say, it's a ball that doesn't deflate, and talk about what the pros and cons are of that. Hero worship. These are stories that celebrate people for their good qualities. Very often someone who gives up a comfortable position to go work, you know, in something more selfless, they're generous. They're not solutions journalism if they're not interested in results. What was the work? What was the work the person did, and what results did they get? That is a very important key of a solutions journalism story. We don't always have great evidence, but we're always interested in what the results are. Favor for a friend. This is a PR story. The first line of that story on Tom's Shoes is, the idea was genius, really. Could have been written by Tom's Shoes. So always a solutions journalism story has to show the limitations of what the responses you're covering. What are the downsides? This one's a little bit more subtle of a distinction. A think tank story is one where the journalist says, here's how I think a problem should be solved. An op-ed, basically. It's me saying, let's do this, and it's theoretical. It's aimed at the future. Real solutions journalism is not opinion writing. It is covering the news. It is covering something on the ground that's going on. If there is nothing to cover, you cannot do a solutions journalism story. So instead of saying something theoretical and future-oriented, it is covering real responses that are happening or that did happen. You can write about something that happened in the past as well. But you got to have something concrete to report on. Otherwise, you don't know what's working and what's not working about it. Afterthought. We always do these stories. This was a documentary about the prison industrial complex that spent 85 of its 90 minutes on the evils of the prison industrial complex. And then apparently the director said, geez, I can't leave people on such a downer. So I'm just going to mention that there's things going on to try and solve the problem. Mentioning isn't solutions journalism. Real solutions journalism investigates what the response is. What is working about it, what is not working about it, which gets to the problem a lot of you raise, which is how do you do this in a short, quick story? And we'll talk about that a little later. instant activist. These are stories that tell the audience, here's how you can become part of the solution. Or they say, here's how our news organization is part of the solution. Some news organizations are comfortable with that. Personally, I'm not. You can add it onto solutions journalism, but it's not solutions journalism. Solutions journalism is simply reporting on something that's going on. And then finally, last imposter, my favorite, is our house mascot, Crispy Bacon, the disabled pig who's human, made him a little wheelchair. I don't even know why people think that this kind of thing is solutions journalism. Makes you feel good about the human condition, I guess. But real solutions journalism is not just inspirational. Sometimes it's not inspirational at all. Sometimes it can be pretty sobering because you're putting the solution in context of a very big problem. And it's got to be insightful. It has to offer useful information. So here's the 4 qualities of a solutions journalism story. It always, every story has characters, right? Got to write about people. But you're showing them trying to solve a problem. The real hero of the story is the work. What's the response? How did it happen? Second, you need evidence of results. You need to look at what's going on as a result of this. Somebody's good intentions isn't interesting. And there are cases when you're writing about something and you don't have good evidence. Those are okay stories in some cases, and we'll talk about that. You have to make a good, clear case for why you're writing about it anyway, even though there's no evidence. And there's often times to do that, but it's not good enough just to say good intentions. Third, it's got to be insightful and not just inspirational. And fourth, you must cover the limitations and make it as far from a PR piece as you can. Covering the limitations is one way of doing that. There are other ways. So I would love to talk about these 4 qualities in the context of this fantastic series and this fantastic story by Sarah, and this story in The Guardian, and this story. Have people read them? That was your assigned homework. Please raise your hands if you did. Whoa.
I didn't read this one. I read the other one.
Okay. I think I might have sent around the wrong link for minimum mic.
To a CBC story.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. That's my fault. It's too bad because that's a good story. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about these stories, these 4 stories, in this context. Okay, so let's talk about. Let's talk about Sarah's story on Cleveland and what that does to fulfill these 4 qualities. So first of all, does it feature not just a person but a response to a problem and how it happened? What's that response?
The response is to use local institutions with buying power and getting them to look at the idea of spending locally and hiring locally to improve the situation for people who live there, because you have high unemployment and you have a lot of hopelessness.
Right, Sarah? That's the response you covered? Okay. Was there any evidence of results? Jobs. Okay. What else? Some jobs, but not huge numbers, right? Kind of a bit of a small solution to a very big problem, or at least small at the moment.
I think that the fact that the decline did not continue, the population of the city had fallen so much, and you saw something like, a return of hope to some extent, and maybe stability, and maybe the evidence of stability is part of the solution.
Okay, good.
Just even that the anchor institutions could survive, right?
I'm sorry?
Just that the anchor institutions could survive.
The anchor institutions could survive. That's a piece of results, yes. Okay, what else is results?
I can't remember what the specific numbers were, but that was it a quarter of their ordering had to come locally, or 20%, so they could measure it.
Okay, so that's a great detail in how they went about doing the response. Okay, insights. Were there insights here that another city might say, like Toronto, for example, which pretty clearly says, we can learn from this. Yes, right? The response was described very clearly in a way that says, here's how another city could replicate this.
Yeah, it wasn't spelled out, but we have huge anchor institutions in the city with the ability to, to use their economic power to raise up, the population.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, why did you decide to write this story?
Gosh, I feel like this was 1,000 years ago that I did it. But I think I've been writing a lot about precarious work, and I wanted to look at some of the ways the city was able to use the resources it does have to address issues around inclusion and poverty. And I knew that Toronto was interested in that model and that there'd been some preliminary discussions.
How did you find out about it?
I think it was because the folks from Cleveland had actually visited Toronto, the city of Toronto, municipality that looks at these kind of issues. And I knew that they had a meeting and some discussion about how Toronto might have jobs and the things that Cleveland did. And then I just, started reading more and chatting with the leaders in Cleveland that were really spearheading it.
Did you go to Cleveland?
Yes.
How much time did you spend there?
I was there for, I think, 2 days, I think, so not that long, but I packed a lot in while I was there.
Yeah. Could you have done the story without going?
Probably, but I think that's something I wrestle with on my beat, because often the U.S. is a little bit further ahead, both in the problems but also in tackling them than we are here. But we don't really have a lot of money to invest, obviously, in traveling. But I think, especially in terms of the limitations, I think it would have been really hard for me to report that had I not been in Cleveland, because I literally just went to a convenience store and chatted to some people in some of the more disenfranchised areas, and you don't get that obviously kind of access reporting from Toronto. And also it's really evocative to just see this city that in so many areas is really hollowed out, and to look at the ways that it's kind of see physically the ways that it's kind of regenerating. So I think it really just helped to be able to go.
So part of the value of going was to see for yourself what the scene looks like, and also to be able to knock on doors, basically, box popular, that's very difficult to get. Okay, so did you need to go to know it was a story?
No, and I certainly could have done, I could have done all the kind of institutional interviews without going there. It was more the color and the, I think the more boots on the ground, human side of the reporting that I needed to be there for.
Okay, limitations. Did this piece cover what was not working, or still challenging, or not working yet?
That the people didn't trust system yet. Small number of jobs that were created.
Okay. Great. Okay. Did enough people read the rhino story that we can talk about it?
Yep.
Okay, so let's go over these with our rhinos. What's the response?
I'm spending, quite a bit of money to actually remove these horns, to use helicopters, train veterinarians, people with chainsaws. That took an investment. It took a lot of money in places where people don't have a lot of money. Governments don't have a lot of money.
Yeah. So response was protecting these rhinos by taking away the thing that's most valuable. Okay. Evidence of results?
Reductions in the number of poaching.
Was there?
There, I believe there was some reduction, yeah. Certainly the animals who had their horns removed were not poached as much, but there were examples of animals still being poached.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So, insights? What can we learn from this? What would somebody who's interested in protecting rhinos get out of this, Julie?
Well, beyond protecting rhinos, I mean, it's a shocking thing to do, to save a rhino by cutting its horn off, and it sort of made you go, wow, that is really thinking outside the box to solve this problem, which kind of broadens your view of any problem. Like, what kind of strange thing might solve this? What it left you with. Interesting.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to the question I asked, is that, is this really a solution to the problem? Who decides if this is a solution? Because essentially you are doing what you are afraid will happen. You are perpetuating that specific thing that happens to rhinos, just to remove something that's outside.
Except they're alive.
They're alive. Yeah, I mean they're alive, yeah, but the image they had in the story, the rhino just like staring, and without that, it was just like, is that the word we want to get at?
Right. So, who decides? What makes this a solution story? You agree that this is a story worth writing about?
Yes.
Is this worth covering? Why?
They are conflicted themselves. Like they know this is not the ideal solution. Even when people went for the stumps and then having to now stump it, like they knew that it was not ideal, but it's all that they could think of. And I think people who are really interested is saying, this is how we push the box. Where can you take this?
Yeah. So yeah, it's also similar to we're covering a lot of overdoses in the city. It's an example, sort of like a short-term emergency solution when you can't fix the bigger problem. So what else can you do, right? Horns
and it's irreversible. You can't put the horns back on. Like it's a solution that can't be undone. If at some point in the future we realize, oh, we shouldn't have done that.
The horns grow back.
But they grow back.
They grow back.
That's another limitation. Yeah. So if there were another way of dealing with this problem of poaching of rhinos, let's say there was another way, does that make this story not a good story or two? No. Can you do the other one also? Yes. Okay. So does this story claim to be the solution? No. It's pretty good about saying we're kind of uneasy about this.
No, just because like it's not a solution. They're just doing what they can to stop a problem that they can't stop. So it's a temporary solution. That's not a fix. It's just
Well, right. I mean, we have a strange relationship with the word solution, which is, as you know, in the name of our organization. We actually should be called the responses to problems journalism. Never. It doesn't sound as good. No, it doesn't. We're kind of stuck with this now, but a good solution story will never use the word solutions. Okay? It's really about responses, because there is never the solution. And it's very often there's no solution to the problem. There's a solution to a small piece of the problem. But if it's a key piece of the problem, then it's useful and interesting. So, I mean, my answer to the question of who decides what's the solution is, the bar's pretty low. You can write lots and lots of solution stories. When we started with the Seattle Times, they were stuck on their first piece because they really wanted to do something on math, teaching math. And one of the women who worked at EdLab said, we can't figure out what the best way of teaching math is, because that's what we want to find out. Well, of course we can't figure out what the best way of teaching math is. Experts don't agree with the best way of teaching math. It's not our job to figure that out. You do not have to identify the best solution. It just has to be an interesting and newsworthy response to a problem. And make sure you tell your audience, this is an interesting and newsworthy response to a problem, not the solution. So problems can have dozens, hundreds of different solution stories. And the question is it a good story? Using the same judgment that we use all the time. Is this something that's going to be of interest to readers? Is it important enough so that it's worth writing about? If it was a story about a rich guy who was buying up all the rhinos in the world and putting them in his own little piece of land, would that be a good solution story? Why not?
It's not systemic. It's not a solution that can be implemented systemically.
Well, I suppose it would depend how few rhinos are left. If there are only 3 left, and it's got all 3 of them fenced in, then that's a good solution story.
Yeah.
Let's hope we don't get there, but.
It strikes me as something that's not replicable anywhere.
Okay, that's a
you
really
have to-
important consideration.
If you wanted to highlight a problem in Toronto, for example, you make it beneficial to say, well, like it did in Cleveland, this is what other cities have done. Here's how we might do it here in Canada.
Yeah.
But it depends on, so it depends on the richness also of this person, like how much wealth does he have, and can someone else in the future have that amount of wealth and do that with another kind of, like it might be a solution that might work for a very small number of people.
Yeah.
But it might be a good story to write anyway.
In my opinion, stories that depend on someone being very rich are cheap in a way. Generally not. But just like a story that says, oh, you know, Westchester County is doing so much better than the Bronx on this thing. Well, okay, yeah, you know, per capita income is 5 times in Westchester County what it is in the Bronx. Not a solution. It's got to be comparable, you know. So if the solution is done by somebody with similar resources to your city, it's going to be more interest to your city than if it's by somebody who's a huge amount of resources. Yes.
I read a lot about poverty, and I'm constantly torn by the charitable model. If, you know, we'll donate more food, bank, we'll donate more to the United Way, we'll donate more, and yet it relies on the kindness, generosity of individuals, and yet it doesn't see a systemic change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sort of push-pull I often have. Like, you know, great if you've got it's sort of an outcropping of this idea. It takes one wealthy.
It's a really good point. There are solution stories in those.
Yeah.
Better responses that are Band-Aid responses. But it is worth saying in the story, this doesn't change.
Which is an interesting, because I've been covering this for a long time with, you know, the food, I've always hated food banks. I was around when the first food bank, when the Daily Bread food bank started. I remember Gerard Kennedy came to the editorial board and told us to start this thing, and I was kind of horrified, because it was kind of before big food bank industry started. It was, you know, the church covered and little charities. And so now a very big part of their campaign is their plea to government for what we need. And so often I will marry my food bank story with, and we need welfare reform, and we need, you know, look at the basic income, and things like that. So is that a solution story? I'm curious. Is that a comment?
The plea for welfare reform isn't, unless you can go to another place that has done that kind of welfare reform and report on it. But there's another interesting consideration here. A lot of times it's hard to do a solution story with politics, except if you look at politics as a field like health or education. In many cases, the issue is political will. There's money. There's not enough political will to apply it here. If there's a place that has figured out where organizers have created a movement that has been able to generate that political will, and that could be a story.
How did they get the public to push the politicians, right? Because we, you know, and childcare, in the 80s, we would go to Scandinavia and write about how it's free there all the time. And we don't do that anymore because, well, that's Europe, they could do it, right? So it's hard.
That's great. I'm interested in how you deal with unintended consequences. So I think we do push for a lot of action, we push for a lot of policy change. And then frequently that will eventually lead to another problem.
Yeah.
And how do we help anticipate that? Like a really cheap and easy, so this is not even exactly what we're talking about, a really cheap and easy one is city doesn't have enough people who can afford things, so you try to bring in good jobs. So you bring in good jobs, and then that drives up housing, and now they have to pay. So that is like they try to fix a problem. And then the solution actually creates a whole other problem. So not that one story should ever have to fix everything by any means, but just how in our thinking constantly we keep in mind those other consequences and keep on it, I guess.
Yeah. there's two different issues here. One is it a story worth telling? And the other is how do you write it? So a change like that is a story worth telling. But you have to include when you write it, here's what's happened as a result, including the unintended consequences. Or you can break it into more pieces. And you have a separate story about here's what's happened as a result of that. But is the story newsworthy? Is it interesting and important? Is one question. That's just completely separate from whether it also did some bad things or it has implications. Yes.
And given that the solutions journalism approach is evidence and results oriented, driven.
Evidence of
like this results and evidence driven.
Mm-hmm.
So does it only work when there's already an existing example that you can build on? And if so, like how? Because there's nothing that's two things that are identical, right? There are a lot of variables. How do you take that example and still tell, think that it can apply? Like what criteria do you use?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. You need something to report on to do a solution story. So there has to be an example.
But what if there's a problem that's so unprecedented? That doesn't mean that solutions journalism may not apply then.
What's the problem that's unprecedented?
Refugee crisis, the global refugee crisis,
okay.
For example.
So any problem that's widely shared, if you'll agree that the global refugee crisis is a widely shared problem, has many different places trying to solve it. And some of those responses are going to be newsworthy and worth reporting on. The problem with the refugee crisis story is that what Germany does is not necessarily relevant to what Canada does. But there's pieces of it that are. I mean, if there's a really great refugee camp, then that might be worth writing about. Cut it into small slices.
People focused.
Yeah, there's no solution story to the Syrian war, but there are solution stories about how a town kept its schools running while it was under bombardment. Small slices are really important to me.
I was just going to say, I'm surprised as part of the formula that you presented that emotional connection is not included, or you could use the text, not just inspiration. And I say emotional, not just because I'm a big ball of fluff, but in each of the stories that you shared, they all had some wonderful text and visuals that to me made that emotional connection that bring home a solution. Like it's easy to do a story of there's this problem, there's this policy, here's some stats, done. But going to, the way Sarah wrote her piece, to me, I can imagine myself walking down, dilapidated street of Cleveland, or the rhino piece, the visuals of the cutoff pieces of the rhino were so impactful. And even thinking of Moira's, which we didn't look at, I was just kind of thinking all of the visuals alone, not even reading her, kind of cover this. So I'm just surprised that emotional connection isn't included in solutions, because to me, that's part of what makes it a solution, because it touches me. Because without those factors, I might not have read any of the stories.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. I think any good story has that emotional connection to it, not just any good solution story. So I think you're right about that. Maybe I just assume that that's in there. If you're including people, you're writing about them solving a problem, it's usually going to have that kick to it. And just problem solving is an emotional, does awaken emotions in the audience, which we'll talk about in a minute in terms of what Kathy was saying about news stories. Just that in itself is something that can be emotional. I wanted to go to first say something about the nursing home piece, which is so fantastic. I mean, one of the best pieces of long-form solutions journalism I've ever seen. I'm not sure that's something a lot of places are going to be able to do quite often, because obviously the resources that were invested in that were amazing. But that was great. She really followed the implementation of that new strategy from beginning to end, checking in with the same people over and over again over the course of a year maybe. Wow. But probably out of range especially under current newsroom conditions. Minimum Mike, the piece is about a courtroom in Barrow, Alaska, above the Arctic Circle, population 3,000, where the courtroom is designed to be friendly to defendants who are on the fetal alcohol syndrome spectrum, and how he runs his courtroom in very different ways. And the interesting thing about it, the reason that I like people to read it, and I'm sorry that I put in the wrong link, was that there's absolutely no evidence of results whatsoever. It talks about what's going on in this courtroom. There's nothing we know about the overall impact of that. We know like how individuals are being treated, but we don't know in general if it's had any effects. But it's a good story anyway. Nobody who reads it would say, shouldn't have written that story because there's no evidence. If there's a brand new, very cool idea, then it can be a solution story, as long as you have something to report on. Even if we don't know anything about the results, you just have to A, say, we don't know anything about the results, and B, here's why I'm writing it anyway. You have to justify to the reader why I'm writing this story, even though we don't have evidence. And the Minimum Mike story was one like that. It was a really interesting idea. And you understand while reading it why it's worth writing about, even though we don't know whether it's successful.
Would you consider it solutions journalism if you offered conflicting solutions?
An example?
Well, I do something every Tuesday, we have a big debate where we have a question, and we have a yes or no answer to it. And often they're diabolically opposed to each other. Diabolically.
They sound diabolical.
Sometimes they are.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we have all kinds of solutions. Like right now in Ontario, for instance, they're debating healthcare. Right? So we have these new healthcare teams. Well, some people are saying it's the worst thing that's ever happening. Some people say this is the best thing that's ever going to happen. And that's a political answer. But that's all. I mean, almost any question, if it's the right question, you can have people on both sides of the equation come forward and say we have the right solution.
And the purpose of doing a solution story is to go examine it on the ground and see what's working and what's not working about it. So you can do lots of different solution stories on the same issue. You can even choose diabolical A and diabolical B, and if they exist, go report on them and see how well they're doing. Where this gets really complicated is, for example, there's a new way of abortion pills by mail that is coming to the United States under the radar. Is that a solution? A lot of people think it is. A lot of people really, really think it isn't. So how do you deal with something like that? My answer would be, you can write about it. Talk about what the debate is. Talk about what the fears are of the opponents that this could make abortion much easier to get and more widespread and, without medical attention necessarily. You can include people's views on it. You're not celebrating a solution, you're covering it. Reporting on it.
In the story Cleveland and Red Paint, when they did Here's What Other Places, did any of them contradict each other? Or were they all kind of the same kind of?
No, they didn't. Okay. This one is not a subject where that would really be an issue. All right.
Process-wise, how you usually go about identifying who you're going to hold up as a solution. So I remember I wrote one story. I went to LA and I wrote about how they tackled wage theft there, and I wanted to go to LA because people in Toronto always say LA has made all these great strides on wage theft, but if you talk to kind of advocates in LA, they think their solutions are crap, but compared to us, they're still better.
That's interesting.
But I don't think they would self-identify
right.
as a solution per se. It's just that they're one step ahead of us.
Right. Well, you can say that. Look, you're not. I understand you guys have all these flaws. You're one step ahead of us. That's why I'm here. And then that's what you say about it. You don't hold it up as a solution.
You touched on this a little bit when you mentioned political will, but I wonder if you could expand a bit. I think a lot of the problems we're facing are the solutions are obvious and well known. They're just very expensive and not even just lack of political will. They're unpopular with people, like pedestrian fatalities is one example. Cars are popular with people. And driving fast is possible.
And that's a real problem in this community is pedestrian fatalities.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you, because we've said lower speed limits,
right.
fewer cars on the road,
Well, my guess would be that that's a problem everywhere. I mean, that every city has people who like to drive fast. And there may be a city that has figured out how to get at those people.
There are, and we've reported on them.
Okay.
It's still very hard to change minds.
Well, then you've done your job. You're not necessarily going to change people's minds. You can report on, here's some of the opposition that this response has come up against, and here's what they did to try and overcome that. Here's what we're doing. And let me move on, because I am conscious. This is normally a 2.5-hour workshop, and we're going to do this in an hour. I didn't realize we had that little time. Sorry. Okay. Oops, this is not the right one. I'm sorry. What happened here? Okay. I'd like to talk about the case for why we should consider using solutions journalism when it's appropriate. And the first reason is impact. So the Cleveland story was one example of that. Here's journalism's theory of change. We point out a problem. Someone swoops in to solve it, from Mars, perhaps. How happy are we with how well that works? Sometimes it does. Most of the time it doesn't. And one reason is that just like people don't change if you just continually point out their flaws, people need to know that change is possible, and someone like me has made those changes. Same thing is true with society. We need models. We need to know that it's possible to do better, and people with my resources are doing better, and it takes away the excuses. So I want to talk about briefly the first story I ever did, the one that really made me realize the value of this approach. And I was working for the Sunday magazine of the New York Times, and it was the year 2000, and I wanted to write a story about the price of AIDS medicines in poor countries, and the fact that these fantastic new antiretroviral drugs, which had made HIV a chronic manageable disease in wealthy countries, were not available in the countries with the highest AIDS burden because they were still $16,000, $20,000 a year. So that was widely known at the time. But what was not widely known was why. And the reason was collusion between the pharmaceutical industry and the government of turn in Washington. At the moment it was Clinton administration, but it didn't matter. To put political pressure on countries that tried to make or buy generic versions of these drugs. That's widely known now, but it was not widely known at the time. And I pitched this to my editor. I thought this is a really important investigative story. And he said, no. Too depressing. We cannot inflict another 7,000-word story on our readers about how everyone with AIDS is going to die in Malawi. So I went home and I rethought the story. And I turned it inside out. There was one country that was making antiretrovirals, generic forms of them, and giving them out to everyone in their country who needed them for free. And that was Brazil. So the story then became what Brazil was doing. And in the course of telling that story, I said everything I wanted to say about what Brazil had to fend off, the bad behavior, and how other countries could not fend that off. And it was a much, much better way of telling the story. So, among other things, got into the paper. It's pretty key. I didn't write the headline. I think that's overclaiming.
That's a big one.
But it also felt fresh and empowering to readers. They did know everyone with AIDS was going to die in Malawi. They did not know that people with HIV were living normal, healthy lives in Brazil. And it was exciting. It made people re-engage with this whole debate about HIV, and it had impact. At the time, the UN was deciding whether to set up the Global Fund. And the pharmaceutical industry was saying, poor countries can't do this, because they'll give out the drugs wrong and it'll mess it all up. And this story showed that that was not the case. And this story will be on my gravestone. But it really made me feel that, and every time I was going to write something that my editor would say, this is too depressing, which is approximately 100% of what I used to write. Was there a solutions angle possible? I would always ask myself that question. It's just good journalism. How many people remember 2014, the Ebola crisis in French West Africa? Raise your hand if you heard of it. Right, like billions of people have heard of it. How many people know that in countries around Sierra Leone and Liberia and Guinea, there were countries that had single-digit or double-digit caseloads and stopped them? Were we aware of that? Not so much. How many people know that there is a vaccine that's 100% effective, and in fact that ended the Ebola epidemic in 2014?
I know there's a vaccine. There's a couple actually, but
how many people know there's a cure? So I understand why we do this, but we should also do this, and this, and this, or we're not being responsible. This is news too. It doesn't get covered.
I think what was interesting about the coverage of the Ebola crisis, the outbreak in Africa, is how, at least in U.S. media, maybe Western media in general, there seemed to be this fear that Ebola was going to transfer.
Yes.
And that's what drove the coverage,
right.
Not the compassion for the people there, but for the fear
exactly.
that it was going to spread.
But then wouldn't it be good to know that there's a vaccine?
Yeah.
So this is important, and I love this cartoon. So it's telling the whole story when we also talk about responses to problems. Third, increase audience engagement and trust. So the American Press Institute did a study of the Seattle Times EdLab section, comparing those stories to comparable traditional education stories. And they found that the solution stories had more than double the page views, almost double the time on page, and more than triple the social shares. And we see this over and over again. There are some studies that have been carried out that do not show more clicks, but they all show more time on page and more social shares. Yes?
So, in that case, why do we not know about the solutions to Ebola, the vaccine, and all of that? Because they should have been just as interesting and catching that many eyeballs.
I think Ebola is a different case, but I think a lot of people don't realize that these stories are popular. They feel like you need to provoke hatred and outrage and rage to get people to pay attention. And in fact, stories that provoke emotions do well. But those emotions do not have to be negative emotions. They can also be hope and excitement. This is part of the Upside, which is one of the at least 34 solutions verticals we know of now in the world. Most of them are in the US. But this 1 in 10 readers of a story in the Upside in the Guardian shares a piece on social. That's very high. This was a Fixes column, a video about a water park and amusement park that were built to include people with very, very severe disabilities. This was the single most shared article on the entire New York Times website in 2017. I didn't do this video because I don't do videos, but it was very good. What Kathy mentioned, there's lots of research that shows that by far the biggest reason for news avoidance is it makes me want to go back to bed and pull the covers over my head. So what do we do about that in a way, but in a way that still allows us to produce serious journalism? We don't want to just say, okay, we're going to do cat videos from now on. So solutions journalism is an answer to that question. In 2008, the AP did a story of how young adults consume news, and they found the same thing. I tune out because of the negativity, but anytime people said, I saw a story about something that could be done, it makes them tune back in. Even if it's a really little story, they grasp onto that as a reason to re-engage. There's a lot of studies that show how viral positive messages are. I don't like the word positive because solution stories very often are not that positive in their tone, but it's kind of shorthand in a way. BBC World Service did a study of their under 35 digital audience. Their top content request was more solutions journalism. Young users really like this, young audiences. The New York Times surveyed its mobile users who are not young, but they're younger than people who read the Times on desktop or in print. And guess what their top content was?
Solutions.
More weather.
More weather.
Solutions was number 2. So the University of Texas's Engaging News Project did a study showing people one of two versions of the same article, and we participated by giving them those two versions. Traditional story that also had a solutions component in it. And you can see how completely different their responses were afterwards. I'm interested in the second one. I would read more articles from the same newspaper. So, trust. I want to talk about trust because I think it's really important and something that we're only starting to realize. Journalism has two crises going on right now. Our long-standing economic crisis and our existential crisis, which may have been equally long-standing. But in the States, we only found out about it November 8th, 2016 at about 10:30 at night.
Trump.
And we realized people don't like us, they don't trust us, they hate us. And when one of the newspapers we work with is the Montgomery, Alabama Advertiser. And the first time I went there, I asked people there, what do you guys think of mainstream media coverage of Alabama? And they all said, we hate it, it's terrible. Well, why? Because you always make us look like ignorant yahoos. And at that time I thought, well, trust is an accuracy problem. They think we're not getting our facts right. So I said, so what's not accurate? How do we make those stories more accurate? And they said, those stories are accurate. We do things that make us look like ignorant yahoos. But we also do things that don't, and you're never interested in those. You're only interested in our worst stereotype and covering us through that. And that is the way every group that sees itself as marginalized thinks. Brownsville, Brooklyn is a low income, high crime, relatively high crime neighborhood of New York. Nothing is very high crime in New York, but this is one of the worst. If you look at the New York Times coverage of Brownsville, it is 98% gun violence. There's a story there about fraud. There's a couple of stories about restaurants, and if you live in Brownsville, you don't like that. You feel like, yes, that's a problem here. But actually, you're kind of less inclined to admit that if someone from the outside is telling you how bad your neighborhood is. You like to actually be able to come up with that yourself and fight other people who say that. But, other things go on here besides gun violence. And we are doing stuff on our own to try and deal with gun violence. And you never report on either of those two things.
We get that complaint here a lot about a couple of communities.
Do you feel it's true?
Yeah, probably. I haven't looked at the data, but I think the perceptions are reality.
Yeah.
There isn't enough solidarity with disenfranchised communities in the newsroom. Because the newsrooms don't represent the communities.
That's true. And newsroom composition is a huge problem. But it is possible to take a different lens on a community and not just say, what is the worst stereotype of the people here? And let me write story after story about how bad that stereotype really is. Which is what we do. Yes.
I think we also have to be careful that instead of switching from the worst stereotype, we go to the best stereotype. So we don't end up presenting them as inspirations and look how they survived everything.
True.
So there needs to be that balance.
Yes.
Like as you said.
I agree. But we all know how to do that. We're good journalists. So solutions journalism is a really important part of trust, because trust, this is our theory, we can't prove it, is not just about facts, it's about story selection. People do not trust us because they feel like we are contemptuous of them, because we make them look like ignorant yahoos. Revenue. We're doing a big project now on this, but we have a bunch of partners who have used solutions journalism to raise money for their newsroom that they would not have been able to do otherwise. Seattle Times, for example, has raised a lot of money for EdLab, sold sponsorship of it, created a newsletter on EdLab, sold sponsorship for that. They've now created a homelessness lab, essentially, called Project Homelessness, which they've raised local money to do, which does solutions and non-solution stories. Traffic Lab, this is a big model for them. The Mansfield, Ohio, tiny little town, red state, Richland Source, which is an online newspaper, does a lot of great solutions journalism, and they asked local businesses that were not advertisers to contribute to a pool of funds to do solutions journalism. And in 1 month, they raised $67,000, which for Mansfield, Ohio, was a lot. Businesses like to be next to new ideas and innovations, and this is something you can offer them with solutions journalism. Foundations like to support these kinds of stories. The trick is to get them to fund more than just solutions journalism. So one of our partners, the Tucson Arizona Daily Star, was doing this big series on foster care, and they decided to add a component of what other states were doing that worked better, and that allowed them to raise foundation money to do the whole investigative series. So this is something we're exploring this that can actually result in money. Okay, so now I want to get into the how. And we've already gone an hour 10. Do we have more time? I'm sorry. All right, feel free to leave if you want. So one big problem in the newsroom for solutions journalism, and one reason why people think this isn't kosher, is this. Inside our profession, if you write a story that says, here's a problem, and it turns out you've gotten it wrong, you've committed a journalistic misdemeanor, a minor crime. If you write a story that says, here's something that's working and you've gotten it wrong, that's a felony. That's a major crime. That's not the way the outside world sees it. They're just the opposite, but that's the way we see it. The worst thing you can do as a journalist is to be seen as naive. You've been snowed by your sources, you're this NGO, you're just doing public relations for them, and we're all terrified of that. So fearless reporters who are unafraid to hold the most powerful people to account are terrified to do a solution story because of this. They don't want it to come out like they've been too gullible. So we have to show how to do these stories with high standards and good journalistic practices. So first thing is, remember that you're just reporting on something. You're covering a response to a problem. You're not celebrating it. So how do we decide if there's a solutions angle to a story? Well, one is you've done the problem over and over again, which most of us have on our beats. Audience knows about the problem. People in Brownsville are aware of gun violence. They might not be aware of solutions to gun violence. But the key here is also that it's a widely shared problem. If it's a problem that lots of people have, and there's many different responses, and some of those might be worth covering, it might be inside your city, it might be elsewhere. Is this a breaking news tool? No, it is not. This is enterprise reporting. But you can use this as a follow-up to breaking news if that breaking news is caused by a widely shared problem. For example, the measles outbreak at Disneyland a couple years ago. I never saw this as a follow-up, but it would have been a good one and a fresh one. Everybody wrote the follow-up, here's the problem, declining vaccination rates. But is there a county that has reversed that decline and started to raise vaccination rates, and how they did it? That would have been a fresh follow-up to a breaking news story. How much evidence do I need? It depends. You can write about a program that has 30 years worth of randomized control trials. Chances are it's not new. News is new stuff. But if you write about something that's brand new, it has no evidence. So you're stuck both ways. But you can write about a solution story at any time during the life of a response, as long as there's a good reason that you're writing about it and you can communicate that reason to your audience, and you tell the audience what we know and what we don't know. I'm going to just race through these and we can discuss afterwards. Big or little? Depends on the scope of the problem. Brazil was a story about as big a story as you can get in scope. It was about the response of a large country because it was a global problem and the response was being handled at the country level. If you have a neighborhood level problem and the response is handled at the neighborhood level, then your responses you're going to look at are neighborhood level responses. How do I find the best solution? The perfect way of teaching math doesn't exist, and you don't have to. It's actually kind of liberating to know that I don't have to find the best one. I don't have to justify this as the choice, because I'm going to do another one like 2 weeks from now. So just report the news. If it's a good story, it's worth doing, even if it's not the best. no, there is no such thing as a perfect program, and no one will believe you if you say it is perfect. So you actually have much more authority and credibility by talking about the limitations and acknowledging that there's issues here. It makes your story stronger, not weaker. So how do I avoid advocacy? Even if we're being careful, just by choosing to write about this and not that, am I not advocating for this? That's an issue. So one is, be careful with your language. Don't overclaim, don't predict the future. Two, provide context. Put the response in the full landscape. This is one of several different responses to the problem, and mention some of the others, give them a paragraph or two, or this response has not worked so well in rural areas, but cities have found that it does well. So situate it in context. Make your story, remember to keep in mind that your story is not about the particular program, it's about the idea behind the program. Was one story in the imposters section that was the not imposter, it was about a story about the shortage of rural doctors in the United States, which I understand is a problem here as well. And it was a piece about nurse-led clinics that were staffed entirely by advanced practice nurses with no doctors there. And the reporter, Sabrina Tavernese from the Times, had to go somewhere to situate her story, so she chose a place in Nebraska, a clinic she went to. The story wasn't about that clinic. That clinic was just the narrative focus. The story was about the response of nurse-led clinics with no doctors. So you don't have to actually say that, but if you keep it in mind, it helps you not be an advocate for that particular clinic. And then always discuss the limitations. How do I avoid sounding like I'm just here talking about what great work this NGO is doing? So there's two different ways to find solution stories. And one is you hear about a solution. Here's an NGO that's doing something great, or here's a business that's doing something great. I'm going to go write about that. That can be dangerous. There's lots and lots of good solution stories done that way, but it can be a little dangerous. So to eliminate that danger, you can start with the problem and look for the positive deviant. So that means you take a problem like pedestrian traffic deaths. You list all the slices. What are the components of the problem? What are the important components of the problem? And you may come up with a list of, there's a big lobby by people who like to drive fast, or left turns at night is a particular part of the problem. So you're going to have a list of a dozen, can be hundreds actually, of small slices of the problem. And then look for who's doing better on those small slices. And then what you're going to come up with is a solution or a response that's the same weight as the problem. It's not a 5-ounce solution to a 5-ton problem. So for example, this was from Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting. Oklahoma incarcerates a lot of women, but Tulsa County does not. So Tulsa is a positive deviant. When we get a database, we tend to look for the worst performer, but you can also look for the best performer and look at what that best performer is doing that others are not doing. These are two hospitals in New York State in the same Good Samaritan hospital system. And you can see the different rates of cesarean section, nearly 50%, 18.4%. Well, this one is actually the worst on the list, and this one's the best on the list. So this is like tailor-made. So let's look at what West Islip is doing that is creating this very high, not good rate. But let's also look at what Suffern is doing. What are they doing differently? So take a look at the positive deviant and use that to find stories. Slices. So we talked about this a little. There's like two big overall approaches. One is who's doing better overall, and the other is who may not be doing great, but's doing a lot better than they used to do, and how did they make that improvement? But then there's a lot of small slices. Who's doing it faster, cheaper, more equitably? All of these are small slices. And you're going to choose the ones that are most relevant to the problem. Not every problem has all of these small slices. Some of them have far more. But choose key small slices and say, who's doing better on those? Okay, so to do solution stories on our beats, So finding these stories is very often a question of going to your usual sources, but asking them, who's doing a better job with this? Do you know of anybody who's got a good response to this? Is short solutions journalism possible? Yes, it is. So you might, if you don't have a lot of space or time, you might want to stick to stuff that's in Toronto, in your area, and look for what's going on the ground here, in part because you don't have to travel, and in part because you can feel more confident that you have the context and knowledge that you need to not make a mistake. If you work backwards from a positive deviant, instead of starting with, here's an NGO that has an interesting response, then if it's a database you trust, then you can be pretty sure that what you're writing about is legitimate. And you can say, in a sentence or two, this was a top performer in the database, or it was a top performer among low-income areas in the database. And let's just talk about why. So you don't even have to write much about the why I chose this. You can look at what they did. What was the response? And it's also good if you can write about a problem that's widely known, so you don't have to spend any time on that. You can say it in a sentence and then move on to writing about the response. So different ways of telling these stories. Before we go into that, let's talk about whether there's concerns, questions, comments about the how. Yes?
I had a question about how the organizations that you think do this most effectively staff it. Like, do they have solutions desks, or do they do what we're doing here, sort of train everybody across the nation? It looked like Seattle Times had like labs devoted to particular areas that were like full-time staff.
They do, but they also consider this a tool that everybody can use, which I think is true. It's both. I mean, I think ideally this is just a tool that everyone uses when appropriate, but a lot of places like to gather their solution stories in a vertical. They may not have a dedicated staff, but every week they'll say, who wrote a solution story? And we'll create a vertical and a newsletter. Those are very popular with those stories. So it may seem like there's a dedicated staff, but there isn't.
But you don't need to set up a newsroom team to do it.
You don't, yeah, no.
And in terms of evidence, like, does it always have to be quantitative?
That's a good question. I'd say no. I'd say the standards of evidence you use to say something's a problem are similar to what you would use to say this response is really important. It's not always quantitative. It helps. You can just have a lot of sort of interviews with experts and effective people. Okay, want to briefly on to storytelling? So obviously solution stories have characters. Every story has characters, every good story. But you're not going to just have a static quote from a character. You're going to show them at work. And very often you'll show them trying to solve a problem. What results? Show them struggling. You're going to tell the story of the response by showing the people trying to solve the problem and succeeding or failing. Every good story has tension, something that will keep the reader reading till the end of the story. Now, in a traditional story, it's I say yes, you say no. What's the tension in a solution story? Why would somebody want to keep reading that story?
Ticking clock element, maybe?
I'm sorry?
A ticking clock element or a deadline, maybe?
Okay. Can you say more about that?
Oh, sorry, like if the I don't know, the problem is we need to get math test scores up in a certain amount of time. I don't know.
Oh, I see. And then they have that time deadline. Yeah. Are they going to do it in time?
Yeah,
I see.
to generate tension.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Conflicting evidence, conflicting opinions, perspectives.
Okay. So, yeah.
Maybe coming up against like opposition to their solution.
Right, right. Yeah, so in most cases, the tension isn't does this work? Because your headline is usually going to get that way, right? I mean, here's why I'm writing about this. Or, you know, is it not work, but a step beyond what we've done? But you'll find that that's actually not necessary to keep people reading. We all know who she is. When she gets into trouble, every week, right? Do we ever sit there thinking, oh my God, she's going to get killed? It's her show. You know she's not going to get killed, right? Except for Game of Thrones. It doesn't matter though, because you're still sitting there on the edge of your seat going, oh my God, is she going to get out of this? When in fact your head knows the answer is yes, of course she's going to. But the tension in a solution story is there even if you know that the answer is this actually was successful. We call it a how done it. The question is how did they get to where they got? What did they do that nobody else has done? So that's very often a very simple chronological structure. Here was a problem. Here's how they got to where they are now. Positive deviant is a good way of telling a story. It's another example. This is a map of who's improved exercise levels in the United States between 2001 and 2011. This is Kentucky. What did Kentucky do that other states didn't do? I asked state officials that in Kentucky, and they have no idea. Don't know what the answer is. Can you do a profile as a solution story if these are not hero stories? Yes, you can if you're showing that person at work and you're interested in their results and not just their good intentions. In fact, solutions profiles are a great way of telling solution stories. This is a story about a night ministry in San Francisco. A minister who goes out onto the street all night, and that's his ministry. It's very interesting. But it's a great example of I'm going to come to people where they are. I'm going to meet you where you are. Everyday beat stories. This was a story from a previously violent housing project in Queens that had gone a year with no shootings. So this is the reporter who normally covers only shootings. So it was a nice change for her to do a story about no shootings. Why did that happen? And it was a 90-second story. It wasn't the most in-depth piece of solutions journalism, but she told the story of what happened there, and that was good. New ideas. So if an idea is brand new, as we've said, you still can do a solution story as long as there's something to look at. It can't be totally theoretical. You'll very often have that question mark in the headline. Now we know the answer is yes. This is a fairly old story. But you can do that. It can be a news story. Location transformations are often a good way of doing this. This is a medical center was terrible at hospital-acquired infections and now is mediocre, not great. But how they went from being an F student to being a B- student was the story. And it was interesting. Comparisons. Kyle Kagan is an investigative reporter, and he was doing the story on Santa Ana, California, which is the home county of the Orange County Register, home city, of how they responded to prostitution, which was not very good. It was a revolving door. They kept arresting these women night after night and releasing them in the morning. And in the course of reporting that, he realized that just next door in Anaheim, California, they had a much better system. So he just did chunk A, Santa Ana, chunk B, Anaheim, in the same story. Worked out very well. This was a short, quick solution story. No one in New York City had to ever say anything about what bed bugs is, because we all know what bed bugs is, so you don't have to explain the problem. And it was just about strategies, a couple strategies that New York was using that had produced some notable gains. Took probably 2 or 3 hours. So last in a series for investigations. Very often our last in a series is this really unsatisfying, here's 5 recommendations for how to solve the problem, which no one ever likes writing. But those are actually small slices. And instead of saying, here's a recommendation, you could actually do a story on each one of those 5. Who's doing a better, who shows us that those are, who shows us the evidence that is behind my recommending this? So if you're not comfortable with that sort of, here's how I think we should solve the problem, you can do a solution story to end an investigative series that has equal weight and heft to the stories themselves. So I just want to close. We would normally do an exercise where we would work on our own story ideas. If you want to stay, I'm here the next couple hours if you want me to be. If you want to stay and do that in group, it's fine, or if you just want to come talk to me individually afterwards, that's fine too. But if we have enough interest in doing that group exercise, we can do that. Reporters who use solutions journalism do these two things. What's much more complicated is newsrooms that use solutions journalism. Our biggest issue in the beginning, when we thought we'd have a lot of pushback against the idea of solutions journalism. And people would say, it's not real journalism, we're here to report on problems. We had very little of that. What we had much more problem with was not attitude change, but behavior change. The problem was, it doesn't make any difference how that these stories are more popular. They take so much longer to do that my newsroom, I have to do 3 stories today. So I'll think about that tomorrow, and tomorrow never comes. They're high-value stories. They do mostly require some investment. You can do them short and quick, but most of the time that's not the case. So the big objection is the same objection that journalists have to any kind of high-value journalism. Investigative, explanatory, any of that. We just don't have time. We just have so few resources, we don't have time. We hear less and less. With the collapse of advertising as a business model, we're moving away from a model where what we actually sold was we sold a piece of the reader's attention to an advertiser. Instead, now what we're doing is selling journalism to readers. Subscriptions, sponsorships. If you're a nonprofit, then very often grants, membership. And that's much better for journalism. I mean, a lot of organizations are going to die, but the ones that survive are going to survive because they know how to sell readers journalism that they will buy, they will pay for. And that is not press conference stories or incremental stories. That is high-value stories. So a lot of our partners now are abandoning, and we had very little to do with this, it was just what the market is doing, abandoning the 3 times a day low-value story. Instead, let's spend 3 days and do something that will actually produce more reader engagement, more subscriptions, etc. So this is becoming less and less of an issue as the market is moving in this direction. And that's all. So thank you very, very much for your attention.